A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
You know, Corn, this whole show runs on GPU compute, and we wouldn't be here without Modal.
Seriously. And that's what powers all our text-to-speech. Everything you're hearing right now.
They're an AI infrastructure platform. Developers use them to run GPU workloads in the cloud with zero infrastructure headaches.
If you're building anything with AI, check them out. Modal.com. Imagine you are standing on the walls of Lachish in 701 BCE. You look down, and the Neo-Assyrian army isn't just besieging you. They are building a massive stone ramp right up to your gates. And if you look at the stone reliefs Sennacherib commissioned for his palace later, you see exactly what happened next. Systematic flaying of captives, people being impaled on stakes, and rows of families being marched into exile. It is visceral. It is terrifying, and it frames our entire view of the Iron Age as a non-stop slasher flick. Today's prompt from Daniel is about exactly that. He is asking if the ancient world was actually that gritty, or if we are just victims of a historical highlight reel where we only remember the juicy bits and skip the centuries of boring farming.
Herman Poppleberry here, and Corn, you hit on the perfect starting point with the Assyrians. They were the masters of psychological warfare via interior decorating, but Daniel's question touches on a massive debate in historiography and anthropology. Are we living in the long peace as Steven Pinker suggests, or is our perception of ancient violence just a result of sampling bias? By the way, today's episode is powered by Google Gemini 3 Flash, which is fitting because we are using cutting-edge processing to look at some very old, very dusty data.
I like that the AI is helping us figure out if humans have always been this twitchy. But seriously, Herman, when I read Thucydides or Josephus, it feels like if a year goes by without a city being razed, the historian just forgot to write it down. Is it possible that peace was just considered the off-season for these guys?
That is the highlight reel hypothesis in a nutshell. Think about who was writing these accounts. You mentioned Thucydides. He was a general. Polybius was a political prisoner and advisor. To them, history was a pedagogical tool for elite men. If you weren't talking about a phalanx or a heavy-handed diplomatic betrayal, you weren't writing history, you were writing an agricultural ledger. And those ledgers existed. We have tens of thousands of administrative tablets from Mesopotamia that talk about grain rations, beer production, and who owes 3 sheep to the local temple. But nobody makes a blockbuster movie about the Great Barley Audit of 1800 BCE.
The Audit of the Rings. I'd watch it for the sheer boredom of it. But wait, if these ledgers exist, why don't they make it into the popular narrative? Is it just because they're boring? Or is there a structural reason why the boring stuff gets buried?
It's a bit of both. Historians in the 19th century who really shaped our modern curricula were obsessed with great men and great events. They wanted narratives of transformation. A ledger showing that a village produced the same amount of wheat for 40 years doesn't show transformation, it shows stability. Stability is the enemy of a good story. Furthermore, there's the issue of translation. We have backlogs of cuneiform tablets sitting in museum basements that haven't been read in 100 years because scholars would rather translate a new fragment of the Epic of Gilgamesh than 1,000 tax receipts for onions.
So we're literally choosing the drama. But there is a mechanism here, right? It isn't just that the writers were biased. It is that the physical evidence of peace is inherently less durable than the evidence of war. A burnt layer in an archaeological dig is a clear, distinct timestamp. A destruction layer tells a story. A 500 years of peaceful crop rotation layer just looks like dirt.
Precisely. Well, let me rephrase. You have identified the core archaeological challenge. We call it taphonomic bias. If I build a beautiful wooden villa and live in peace for 80 years, the wood rots, the garden overgrows, and eventually it's just a grassy mound. But if you come along and burn my villa down, the charcoal preserves the floor plan, the arrowheads stay in the soil, and the skeletal remains with unhealed perifractures. Those are breaks in the forearm from holding your arm up to block a club. They tell a vivid, violent story that survives 5,000 years. We are literally looking at a non-random sample of the worst days in human history.
It's like looking at a social media feed where everyone only posts their car crashes. If you didn't know better, you'd think driving was a death sentence. But let's play devil's advocate here. Even if we account for the juicy bits, bias, wasn't the baseline for normal behavior way more violent? I mean, we have police departments and courtrooms. If my neighbor steals my goat today, I call the authorities. In 1200 BCE, if my neighbor steals my goat, I probably have to gather my cousins and burn his hut down. Otherwise I look weak and everyone else steals my goats too.
That is the weak institution argument, and it is backed by some pretty sobering bioarchaeological data. While the historians might give us the great man version of war, the bones give us the everyman version of interpersonal violence. Take Çatalhöyük in modern-day Turkey, roughly 7,000 to 6,000 BCE. Analysis of the skulls there showed that about 12% of the individuals had evidence of healed or lethal cranial trauma. 12%. In a modern industrial society, the rate of interpersonal violent trauma on skeletal remains is usually well under 1%.
12% is, I should probably wear a helmet to dinner territory. But how do we know that's interpersonal? Violence and not just, I don't know, people falling off ladders or getting kicked by livestock.
Forensic anthropologists look at the signature of the wound. If you fall off a ladder, you tend to have certain types of fractures on your limbs or the base of your skull. At Çatalhöyük, many of these injuries were depressed cranial fractures on the top or back of the head, often caused by small, round, hard objects, like sling stones or maces. And interestingly, many of these wounds were on the backs of heads, suggesting people were being struck from behind or while fleeing. That's not a farming accident, that's a mugging or a domestic dispute settled with a rock.
So, even if there isn't a great war happening, the local pub crawl has a decent chance of ending in a mace to the face.
It's about the monopoly on violence. Max Weber famously defined the state as an entity that has a monopoly on the legitimate use of physical force. In the ancient world, especially in the Dark Ages or tribal periods, that monopoly didn't exist. Justice was decentralized. We see this in the noble savage myth debunking. There was this romantic idea for a long time that pre-state societies were peaceful and communal, but the data from sites like Site 117 in Nubia, which is about 12,000 years old, shows that nearly half the people buried there died from stone projectile wounds. It wasn't war, in the sense of two armies in uniforms, it was a perpetual, low-level state of lethal raiding.
So it's a matter of scale versus frequency. Today, we might have these massive, terrifying state-on-state conflicts. I think the Uppsala Conflict Data Program said there were 55 active state-based conflicts in 2023, but the average guy in the suburbs isn't worried about his neighbors spearfishing him over a property line.
That's the distinction Steven Pinker makes in The Better Angels of Our Nature. He argues that while the capacity for violence has increased because of technology, the probability of an individual dying a violent death has plummeted. In a tribal society, you might have a 15 to 25% chance of dying at the hands of another human. Even in the bloody 20th century, with 2 world wars and the Holocaust, the global violent death rate was somewhere around 1%.
I can hear the skeptics already, Herman, and honestly, I'm one of them. Isn't there a bit of modernity bias in those numbers? If you're a civilian in a conflict zone right now, those 1% global stats don't mean much. Also, ancient violence was honest in a weird way. It was hand to hand. You saw the guy. Modern violence is industrialized. You can delete a city block with a button. Does the fact that we do it more efficiently, and rarely, actually make us less violent, or just more terrifyingly capable?
That is exactly what philosopher John Gray argues against Pinker. He calls it wishful thinking. Gray's point is that we haven't fundamentally changed our nature, we've just changed our management style. But if we look at the structural violence, things like the judicial system, the ancient world was objectively grittier. Look at the Roman concept of decimations. If a legion performed poorly, they would line them up and every 10th man would be beaten to death by the other 9. That was an administrative discipline. That was human resources for the Romans.
Talk about a hostile work environment. Sorry, Bob, you're the 10th guy this month. The boys are going to have to club you. It's the casual nature of it that gets me. We see it in the Bible, in Homer, in the sagas. There's a scene in the Iliad where a character is begging for his life, and Achilles basically says, "Look, Patroclus died, and he was a better man than you, so just hold still while I kill you." It's very matter of fact.
It's the honor culture versus dignity culture shift. In an honor culture, your worth is tied to your reputation and your ability to retaliate. If you don't fight back, you lose your status, your property, and your safety. In that world, violence isn't a malfunction of society, it's the primary regulatory mechanism. When we read ancient history, we are reading the chronicles of an honor-based world. So when Daniel asks if it's just the juicy bits, the answer is that the juicy bits were the currency of the time. Glory was bought with blood because there wasn't a stock market or a LinkedIn profile to prove your worth.
But how did people actually live day to day in that environment? If you're a farmer in ancient Sumer, and you know that honor dictates your neighbor might kill you over a boundary stone, how do you even get the courage to plant a field?
You rely on fictive kinship and very rigid social rituals. You don't just farm alone, you farm as part of a clan. The clan provides the deterrence. If you kill me, my 20 cousins will kill you and your 20 cousins. This is the feud system. It's gritty, yes, but it's also a form of stability. It's a cold war at the village level. People weren't necessarily more bloodthirsty, they were just operating in a system where the cost of peace was the constant, credible threat of extreme violence.
Okay, so let's talk about the long peace and the N-curve theory you mentioned in the notes. This idea that violence was high, then dipped when the early states took over, then spiked again. How does that fit into our gritty perception? Because if the early empires like Rome or the Han dynasty actually reduced violence by imposing pacts, why do we remember them as so violent?
Because the Pax Romana wasn't peace in the sense of everyone loves each other. It was peace in the sense of we have killed everyone who disagreed with us, and now we are the only ones allowed to be violent. The state reduced interpersonal murder rates by being the biggest bully on the block. But to maintain that status, the state has to perform spectacular acts of violence to remind everyone why they shouldn't rebel. The Colosseum wasn't just entertainment, it was a state-sponsored demonstration of the power of life and death. We remember the violence of the Roman Empire because the Romans wanted us to remember it. It was their branding.
It's a marketing campaign. Submit or be fed to a lion. Very effective. But there's another layer here, chronological compression. This is something I think about a lot when people talk about the ancient world, as if it's one weekend. We might read a 500-year history of the Roman Republic in 3 hours. On page 10, there's a war with the Samnites. On page 15, the Carthaginians are crossing the Alps. On page 20, Caesar is crossing the Rubicon. It feels like non-stop chaos.
Imagine if a historian in the year 4000 wrote a history of the United States in 20 pages. Page 1, Revolutionary War. Page 2, War of 1812. Page 3, Civil War. Page 4, World War I. To a reader in the future, it would look like Americans never stopped shooting at each other for even a single day. They would miss the fact that there were 30-year stretches where the most exciting thing that happened in a small town in Ohio was a particularly large pumpkin at the county fair.
But in reality, those gaps between the pages are decades, sometimes generations of people just waking up, complaining about the price of grain, worrying about the rain, and trying to get their kids married off. A Roman citizen in southern Gaul might have lived from the year 50 CE to 120 CE and never seen a soldier draw a sword in anger. They might have heard about a border skirmish in Dacia, but to them, life was fundamentally about olives and taxes.
It's the same thing with news today, right? If you watch the news for an hour, you see every disaster on the planet. If you then walk outside to your quiet street, there's a massive reality gap. The ancient historians were the original 24-hour news cycle. They didn't have a local human interest segment. It was just, the Persians are back, and they brought 1 million friends.
And that has a huge effect on how we perceive the grittiness. But we have to be careful not to swing too far the other way and sanitize the past. There's a trend in some modern scholarship to play down the violence, because we don't want to seem like we're being Eurocentric or judgmental of other cultures. But the skeletal data doesn't care about our modern sensibilities. When you find a mass grave at Crow Creek in South Dakota from 1325 CE, long before European contact, where 60% of the population was massacred and mutilated, you can't highlight real your way out of that. That was a systemic, catastrophic event. 60%? That isn't a war, that's an extinction event. What caused that? Was it resource scarcity?
Likely a combination of drought and overpopulation. And that brings up a second-order effect of ancient violence. In the modern world, we have global supply chains. If there's a drought in one area, we ship food from another. In the ancient world, if your crops failed and your neighbor had grain, the rational move, in a brutal survival sense, was often violence. Violence was a resource acquisition strategy. It wasn't just grittiness for the sake of being tough, it was the only available insurance policy against famine.
So, gritty isn't a personality trait of ancient people. It's a side effect of living on the edge of starvation without a global safety net. I wonder how much of our perception is influenced by the technology of the time. If you're fighting with a bronze sword, you have to look into the eyes of the guy you're killing. Does that make the society more gritty? Because the violence is intimate, or does it actually act as a limit because most people, despite what the war correspondents say, actually don't like killing people up close?
There is a lot of research on this. Dave Grossman's On Killing is a famous, if controversial, look at the psychological resistance to killing. In the ancient world, you had to be conditioned for it much more intensely. But conversely, the medical technology meant that a minor wound was often a death sentence. In modern conflict, the wounded to killed ratio is very high because of body armor and rapid medevac. In the ancient world, if you got poked in the gut with a spear, you weren't wounded. You were a dead man walking from peritonitis. So, every conflict had a much higher lethality rate per participant.
That makes a lot of sense. A skirmish in 700 BCE might result in 20 deaths. A skirmish today might result in 0 deaths and 3 guys getting patched up in a field hospital. The grittiness is partly just the lack of antibiotics.
Well, again, I'm trying to avoid that word. It's the reality of the biological baseline. But let's look at the sampling problem from another angle. Think about what we don't have. We have the Great Wars because they were written on stone or copied by monks. But what about the millions of ordinary lives? If we had a Twitter archive from ancient Babylon, would it be 90% look at this cool cat I found, and 10% the Hittites are invading again?
I bet it would be mostly my boss is an idiot and the beer at this tavern is watered down. We actually have those letters. There's that famous letter from a guy named Nani to a copper merchant named Ea Nazir from about 1750 BCE, complaining that the copper he bought was substandard and that his messenger was treated rudely. It's the world's oldest one-star Yelp review. There's no mention of war, just, you sold me bad copper and I'm mad about it.
I love Ea Nasser. He is the patron saint of the non-juicy bits of history. That letter proves that for most people, the grittiness of life was about commerce, quality control, and interpersonal slights, not dodging chariots. So, Daniel's question, is it a highlight reel? Yes, we are reading the highlights of the elites. But is it how they rolled? Also yes, because the risk of violence was a constant shadow in a way we can't really comprehend. It's like living in a neighborhood with a very high crime rate. You might not get mugged every day, but you lock your doors, you don't go out at night, and it shapes your entire psychology. Ancient society was locked doors, psychology 24/7.
That locked doors analogy is interesting. If you look at ancient city planning, almost every major settlement has walls. You don't build a 20-foot thick stone wall around your city because you're having a long peace. You build it because you know that, eventually, someone is going to show up with a battering ram. The very architecture of the ancient world is an admission of constant threat.
And even within the walls, the grittiness continued. We often forget about the lack of light. Once the sun went down in an ancient city, it was pitch black. There were no streetlights. If you were out at night, you were either a criminal, a victim, or a watchman. The gritty atmosphere of a noir film is actually a pretty accurate representation of a Tuesday night in ancient Rome. Crime was rampant, and there was no professional police force to stop it. If you got mugged, your only recourse was to scream, "Quirites!" a call for fellow citizens to help and hope they liked you enough to come running.
That's a great way to put it. It's a background radiation of violence. Even if the sun is shining and you're harvesting olives, you know that 3 days away, there's an army that doesn't recognize your right to exist. So, let's pivot to the takeaways for a second. If we accept that our view is skewed by both the juicy bits of historians and the gritty reality of weak institutions, how should we look at history differently?
First, we have to start asking what is not now being recorded. When you read about the Peloponnesian War, try to imagine the farmers in the background who just wanted both sides to go away so they could pick their grapes. We need to look at the absence of evidence as evidence of peace. If a city has no city walls, that is a massive statement about the security of that region. The Minoans on Crete, for example, for a long time, people pointed to their lack of fortifications as evidence of a peaceful utopia.
And let me guess, the bones told a different story?
Well, the bones showed that they were still hitting each other, but it suggests a different kind of society. One where the threat wasn't a neighboring army, but perhaps internal social control. The second takeaway is to use modern data as a sanity check. When an ancient historian says an army of 1,000,000 men was slaughtered, we can look at modern logistics and say, that's physically impossible. They couldn't have fed them. We have to treat ancient numbers as emotional data, not statistical data. 1,000,000 just means a lot, and I was scared.
Emotional data. I'm going to use that next time I exaggerate how many emails I have. I have 1,000,000 unread messages, Herman. It's emotional data. But seriously, applying this critical framework to modern news is actually a really useful skill. We are living through a highlight reel right now. If someone in the year 4000 reads our digital remains and all they find are news headlines and Twitter arguments, they're going to think 2026 was a non-stop apocalypse.
They'll think we lived in a state of constant civil war and environmental collapse. They won't see the millions of people who went to work, had a nice dinner with their families, and watched a movie. We are creating our own juicy bits bias in real time. The difference is we have the capacity to record the mundane at a scale the ancients never dreamed of. We are the first generation that will leave behind a low-light reel.
My weird prompts. The low light reel. I like it. But there's a danger there too, right? If we focus too much on the long piece and the mundane, do we become complacent? Do we forget that those weak institutions are the only thing standing between us and a 12% cranial trauma rate?
That is the fragility argument. The grittiness of the ancient world wasn't because they were bad people. It's because they hadn't built the software of civilization yet. The laws, the norms, the surplus food, the rapid communication. We have the software, but software can crash. Looking at the gritty past isn't just a fun history lesson, it's a look at the default settings of humanity when the systems fail.
It's the system restore point we don't want to go back to. I think about the Bronze Age collapse, roughly 1200 BCE. You had this interconnected, globalized for the time, system of empires, Egyptians, Hittites, Mycenaeans. They were trading, they were writing letters, they had international law. And then, within a few decades, it all fell apart. The juicy bits of that era are terrifying, cities burning, sea peoples invading. But the gritty reality was likely millions of people suddenly finding out that the software had been deleted and they were back to self-help, justice.
And that is where the end curve gets scary. If we are at the bottom of the curve now, in a period of relative peace, we have to recognize that it's an active achievement, not a natural state. The grittiness of history is the natural state. Peace is an artificial construct that requires constant maintenance. It's like a garden. If you stop weeding, the grittiness of the wilderness returns in a single season.
So, to answer Daniel's question, was it just how they rolled? Yes. They rolled in a world where the maintenance was manual and very, very expensive. And our impression is skewed because the manual maintenance usually involved a sword. But maybe the real juicy bit is that despite all that, they still found time to complain about bad copper and brew beer.
I think that's a perfect summary. We shouldn't dismiss the violence as exaggeration, but we should recognize the peace as missing data. History is a puzzle where we've lost 80% of the pieces, and most of the pieces we have left are the ones with blood on them.
Well, that's a sobering thought to end the segment on. But before we wrap up, I want to touch on the future implications. Part of Daniel's prompt. As we get better at archaeology using things like LiDAR to find hidden cities or AI to piece together those thousands of boring administrative tablets, do you think our gritty view of the past will soften?
I do. I think we are going to find that the ancient world was much more crowded and busy than we realized. When we find more mundane evidence, the war pieces of the puzzle will start to look smaller in comparison to the life pieces. we might find that the Assyrian war machine was actually a very small part of a very large, very complex society that spent 90% of its time worrying about irrigation and temple festivals. We're already seeing this in the Amazon, where LiDAR is revealing massive, peaceful urban complexes that we previously thought were just empty jungle.
I hope so. I'd like to think that even in the gritty past, people were mostly just trying to live their lives. It makes them feel more like us, and it makes us feel a little more responsible for keeping our own software running. It's easy to feel disconnected from a guy being flayed on an Assyrian relief, but it's hard to feel disconnected from a guy complaining about his delivery being late.
That is the ultimate value of history. It's a mirror. If you see a monster in the mirror, you have to ask if it's the glass or the person standing in front of it. We look at the past and see grittiness because we are looking for the peaks of human emotion, but the valleys, the quiet, boring centuries, are where most of humanity actually lived.
Deep stuff, Herman. For a donkey, you've got a lot of soul.
And for a sloth, you're surprisingly quick on the uptake.
I have my moments. All right, I think we've thoroughly explored the gritty versus highlight reel debate. It's a bit of both, as most things are. The ancient world was objectively more dangerous for your average person, but the story we tell about it is definitely filtered for maximum drama.
History is the version of past events that people have decided to agree upon, as Napoleon supposedly said. And people usually agree that explosions are more interesting than crop yields.
True that. Well, thanks for the deep dive, Herman. I've learned that I would definitely not have survived the Bronze Age, mostly because I can't block a mace with my forearm.
You'd be the guy writing the one-star copper review, Corn. You'd be fine.
I'll take it. Ian Nazar was a hack, 1 star.
Thanks as always to our producer, Hilbert Flumingtop, for keeping the gears turning behind the scenes. And a big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power this show's research and scripting.
This has been my Weird Prompts. If you're enjoying these deep dives into the gritty and the mundane, do us a favor and leave a review on your favorite podcast app. It really helps other curious minds find the show.
We'll be back next time with whatever weirdness Daniel throws our way. Until then, keep your software updated and your cranial trauma to a minimum.
See ya.
Goodbye.
This episode was produced using Google Gemini 3 Flash, text-to-speech by Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My Weird Prompts.